The tract homes here are a nightmare. They're like 4 feet apart, and I have videos and protests exposing it.
Well, I don't know that there's necessarily a problem with having houses close together. After all,
well, no. It's
about
not
5,000 years ago, invented the curtain.
It's not that. It's that they're close together, but they're car dependent, and they're not easy walking access to anything.
Well, that I understand.
Well,
Where are you, by the way?
Well, one thing I would note is that the efficiency of houses in terms of the energy per square foot has gone up greatly, but because our houses have hugely increased in size, like all those efficiency losses have been all those efficiency gains have been lost.
Yeah, so in other words, we're building McMansions, not real mansions.
Right. So we live in really large homes, and so that pretty much, it pretty much causes us to use a huge amount of energy, even compared to like the 1950s.
So let's make sure and let us know where we all calling from. You're calling from San Clemente, right?
Correct. Yes.
And Mr. Kunstler, is that what, Saratoga Springs?
I'm actually in a small town 15 miles east of Saratoga Springs.
Okay, cool. So that means you're in what?
I'm in Washington County, New York. I'm about 10 miles from the Vermont border.
I was going to say that.
I'm on the east side of the Hudson River, and it's a small factory village that doesn't have any factories left, and it's kind of a flyover corner of the country.
I was going to tell you later on, this country's in a lot of decline. These trade deals have really screwed this country up, and I just don't know if we'll be able to recover. Where I live, it really wasn't screwed by the trade deals, but it's really a byproduct of the trade deals. And Mr. Kunstler, I think it's probably the worst place to be.
You didn't say where you are.
Oh, he's from Las Vegas, and I'm from San Clemente, California.
You should have made him guess. Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, it's like I should guess whether you're going to call me or not.
Okay.
Yeah, I just have to say, it's, there's opportunities here. It's fun, but it's corrupt in many ways, and it's ugly.
Well, why on earth do you want to stay in that part of the country?
Well, I actually was thinking about other places, but, when there's a soul that tells you there's hope and you can make it, and, you just don't know what to do. And I think the problem is...
Are you from there?
No, but I just have to say, because other places aren't, where else can you go? That's the problem. Americans have limited choice. There is no free choice. California is a mess. Phoenix...
Well, wait a minute. There is free choice, but you're right. It is limited, and there aren't that many places in the country that are very rewarding to live in from the standpoint of the everyday environment. That's for sure.
Right.
But there are places you could go. It's not there aren't zero choices. It's just a little more difficult than it would be if you were in Europe, let's say.
Well, in a lot of things we don't have choices. Like that former comedian George Carlin says we have an illusion of choice. And the worst part is we have it in urban planning. We have the inner cities, which have a lot of corruption, high taxes, crime, hustle and bustle. And rural areas, there's not much to do for a lot of people. And suburbia, which has the disadvantages of both, like you mentioned in End of Suburbia. And the only thing you're getting is just an industrial
lawn, as you called it. I like that phrase.
Yeah. Oh, and we don't have lawns. It's just rocks here, basically.
Yeah, I've been there. I wrote a chapter about it in one of my books.
Yeah.
Oh, I actually have one of your books in front of me. I'm not going to turn on the webcam, but I have in front of me. It's The Geography of Nowhere. So I own that.
Well, I wrote about Las Vegas in a book called The City in Mind.
Okay.
That was 20
and the chapter was called A Utopia of Clowns.
Well, the reason I wanted to do this discussion is because it is now 2020, and we're not too far away from the, and I get the data from the IEA and other places, right? From around the 2030s, when, when at least much of the world's oil should peak, and especially the shale will peak. In fact, I've even seen recent articles about it, how shale will peak around the 2030s in the U.S.
Yeah, I think it might happen before then, and not necessarily because of the depletion problems, but because of the financing problems.
Yeah, you're right.
Right. It is.
Economy,
it does cost a lot of money to make.
Sorry to jump in, but this economy here in Las Vegas, more than the case in America and many parts of the world, is very fragile. As soon as they stop the credit and these low interest rate and lending requirements, here it's going to literally break down. They can't sell these garbage homes anymore. Then they're overpriced.
Mm-hmm.
It's really depressing.
Well, when I was in Las Vegas some years ago, a local guy explained it to me, and at least in one simple way that made it comprehensible. He said that Las Vegas was really one of the last places in America where the equivalent of a blue-collar job can support a family, and that means being a croupier or working in a casino in some way, and that was his take on the whole thing. I think there was something to it, but I would certainly agree that Las Vegas would appear to have an extremely fragile economy based on what we know about how we're living and what we're doing in this country.
Yeah, and it's not just the housing sector, it's the casino sector. And what I have to point out, it's not just discretionary spending. It's just propped up by conventions, more foreign visitors, and it's just really propped up by these nightclub goers who spend hundreds of dollars on drinks. And, what they used to be doing back then is like starting families and having, real jobs to support a family. Now they're just going there, getting drunk and hangovers. It just doesn't add a lot of value to society. And I just have to say, speaking of casinos, it's like, there's a lot of corruption here. It's just so shady. And, people like to moan and complain about California and New York. But I'll tell you what, it's literally like a casino, phony labor union, real estate monster that runs our government.
Well, let me point this out to you. The gambling industry is an industry where there's an awful lot of loose cash changing hands.
Yeah.
And really the only way to enforce the honesty of your employees is to threaten them with violence. So it's no surprise that Las Vegas has always been mobbed up one way or another, because the only business people in America who are willing to do that for the most part are organized crime people. So that's why it infests the gambling industry.
Well, one thing I put on it. Sorry about that. One thing I was gonna say about the blue collar job, right? I wanted to just bring something up there. Mm-hmm. Is that you said Jim said that Las Vegas is one of the last places where you can really have a blue collar job that supports a family. Well, I would say that's part of the reason Trump got elected. I didn't vote for him for that reason. And I admit I voted for him, but that's why I think most people voted for him. They kind of want to go back to the 1950s, which I just don't think is ever going to happen.
Yeah, same with Bernie too. Yeah, because the thing is that it's such a shady place in many ways. Like, you can walk around in the casino, and the casinos can just like push you around and say, "Yeah, you're trespassing. You look suspicious." It's just all of this nonsense. It's just messed up. And speaking of shadiness, you look at Sheldon Adelson, and you have this other guy, Jim Murren, who runs MGM Resorts, and they literally fund and control much of our politicians. So it's like the people don't really have a say. And you have Jim Murren, who started this paid parking plan, and there's a lot of, and I don't mean to sound like a conspiracy job, but he sold company stock before the Route 91 incident. And I don't know what they're trying to do. Trying to commit suicide in that town. raising prices and fees. And of course, we know as a result of that incident, the politicians passed lots and lots of bad laws regarding guns, and a lot of crazy laws in our state, and they just didn't seem to care. And they use these phony labor unions. Labor unions nowadays are a joke in America, and casinos, I think, hire like 50% of their employees foreign born. So the immigration problem isn't just by the border and the big cities; it can happen anywhere, and they use it as political weapon to basically run our elections. And the problem is people don't fight back and overthrow the system.
Well, Cyrus, look at Las Vegas is a place that was founded on all kinds of human perversity.
Yeah.
And I don't mean sexual perversity per se.
That's part of it.
I'm sure there's some of it there, but on all kinds of economic perversity, and it's really a place that doesn't have a future. I wouldn't waste a whole lot of time trying to expect to reform it. You know, it's going to go through its life cycle. Its life cycle will end, and it will become a monument in the desert with nobody there. And I don't know whether that's going to take 50 years or 75 years, or 38 years, but it's coming pretty sooner rather than later to Las Vegas. Everything else about that is just really kind of social psychoanalysis.
Are you sure? I mean, like, the population's going to be zero. We can't just go out.
Oh, I don't know if it'll be zero, but it's not going to be what it is now.
But we can't. You don't think it's right for us to go there and show to the home building, the urban planning system, a big FU, and start to build something different? Something like.
I don't think there's any point in trying to reform Las Vegas per se. I think there's plenty of reason to try to persuade people to do things differently in other parts of America that do have some chance of having a future, but I wouldn't waste any of my energy on Las Vegas. It's really pretty hopeless. It is what it is. It's a manifestation of a lot of economic perversities of the last 100 years, and that's what it is. And it'll drive
because
people
I had
away.
a feeling like, you can build something out in the desert that's more like we used to do 100 years ago and show the world, like, oh, it can be something. Oh, we can bring some of the benefits of the old traditional design, and
forget about it.
But I mean, if
Las
you're
Vegas
saying
is what it
because
is.
of
By the way,
technology and
Cyrus, I'm
resources-
not gonna have an hour-long conversation about Las Vegas.
Okay,
I think I've made the point adequately that it's not worth really.
Right. Let's move on to another point. I personally think this is just based on the research I've been able to do. I'm not as informed as maybe Mr. Kunstler is, but the way I see it is, the best thing you could do is just to, find, like, within the next 10 years, find some way to prepare for the 2030s and 2040s, because that's going to be a rocky time.
Yeah, I've thought about a small town in Idaho, by the way. I mean, those are some retreat locations.
The best place you can go to is if the place has a hydroelectric dam. If you don't need to drive a car there. And now that's a rare combination, but such places do exist, like in Canada or in South America. Yeah.
Well, I want to know his take, because he's not very optimistic about America for a fact, but what is he thinking about all over the world? Do you think like places like Hong Kong, Dubai, all these big cities are going to have serious problems too?
Well, first of all, when you say I'm not optimistic about America, it doesn't mean that I don't think America has
in some ways,
or may have some good things in its future. I think that it probably will. And I put a lot of effort into writing a 4-book series of novels, sort of laying out a picture of what that future might be. The series was called the World Made by Hand series, and the first book was titled World Made by Hand, and then there were 3 others with different titles. And So if anybody wants to get a really full-blown picture of what I imagined was going to be going on, you could try those books. Now, as far as your question goes, if it was a question, I think what we have to see is that we're going to have problems with the scale of the things that we have built and the lives that we have constructed within those things, those cities especially, and the economies that we've built for as an infrastructure for our activities. And the main thing is that the scale is too large. So you can state kind of categorically that anything that's organized at the supergiant scale is not going to do too well in a world that's contracting, an economic world that's contracting, that doesn't have the kind of industrial growth that took us where we are now.
Mm-hmm.
And everything's going to have to get more local and regional.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
places that can't function on that basis at a smaller scale of activity are going to have a problem, and places.
Well, I think in a lot of ways that would be very good for our society, because it's just, there's a lot of good things like local sense of community that's going to come back. But go on, Thomas.
Well, consider like I think I think America's got issues, but I think the places that'll be hit the hardest by far will be China and India, because they just have so many people, and even though their populations are no longer growing, they have so much economic growth that they just keep on, burning through more and more coal, and they're eventually going to deplete all the stuff that's cheap. And they have no real backup plan. They have no way of dealing with it. And they got millions of cars on the road there. And they don't even meet like US emission standards. So they have like the energy problem, and they have the environmental problems, and they just build these really just colossal cities. And those places shouldn't be built in the first place, but the very least they could do is encourage the people there to not drive cars, but they do the opposite. Like everybody in India, they pretty much like ride motorcycles and rickshaws everywhere, and it's just the scale there is just not sustainable.
Yeah. So, and I also wanted to know what's his take, Mr. Kunstler's take in Orange County, where Thomas is. And what about even like my parents' country, known as Iran? It has a similar climate as the one I have now. So, what do you see in those places as well?
Well, I've never been to Iran. I only know what I've seen on the boob tube or read about it. And, they've certainly had a bit of travail for the last 40 years, laboring under a theocracy. And I can imagine that will sometime come to an end because people get sick of it. I don't know how they're going to do. They do have a certain amount of oil, but if they keep on just selling it in order to generate income to keep on expanding their population, that's going to be an error. Any country that doesn't have some kind of a program for facing contraction, I think, is going to have a national problem of one way or another. As far as the Chinese go, they came to the industrial orgy pretty late in the game, and they adopted the template for behaving a certain way that was created in the West.
Right.
And that meant a lot of auto dependency and a lot of consumption and giant skyscraper cities that were overscaled, and they fell for that template, and they did a pretty good job of outfitting it for a short period of time. They did build a lot of these cities, and they built a magnificent railroad system with high-speed rail, and they put in an awful lot of excellent infrastructure. But as you said, Tom, they ultimately, and sooner rather than later, again, are going to face some pretty harsh problems with their energy inputs.
Especially coal.
Well, yeah, coal, of course, is a big problem. They do have a lot of coal, but they're gonna, the quality of the coal that they have is getting worse and worse every year. Excuse me. But they have a bigger problem, I think, with petroleum because they depend on getting a lot of oil, a lot of imported oil, and all that oil is coming through very tenuous supply lines from a long, long distance, and it's going through some interesting choke points like the Straits of Hormuz and the Straits of Malacca. And I could see that they could have a big problem if those choke points were shut down, or if there was just some problem with the supply line at any point along the way.
Right.
In Orange County, do you think, I mean, they have very high real estate values, but their planning is so dependent on literally the automobile.
Oh
So,
yeah, we love to
I would
drive
agree.
more cars than like anyone else. Like we are more
Yeah.
car dependent than your average American.
I was in Orange County about 3 years ago. I spent about 3 or 4 days in Irvine and Newport Beach. And, what can you say about it? It's a goddamn mess. It's badly conceived. And it's another one of those places that doesn't have a future. And the fact that it's booming at the moment, or has been for the last 50 years, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to do well, in the years ahead.
Right.
So anybody who extrapolates the current situation to think that, what's working now is going to be just fine in 20 years, they're making a big mistake. As the economist Herb Stein remarked about 50 years ago, things that can't go on don't.
yeah, and I have to say, speaking of Newport Beach, Balboa Island is pretty nice. The homes and the buildings laid out in the 20s. But it's so sad how it changed later on with Irvine and Mission Viejo, all these curvy streets, all this car dependency and cul-de-sacs. And it's sad. They took very expensive real estate and turned it into just such a mess. And
It was actually very cheap real estate, which is why the Irvine Company, which is this tremendous development company, was able to get a hold of so much of that land.
Well, I was gonna say like.
I'm not finished.
Oh,
You guys
sorry.
got to stop interrupting me.
Sorry about that.
Sorry.
Both of you, especially you, Cyrus. The
Go on.
Irvine Company had a tremendous amount of land, and they just they used the same template for developing each suburban module, and they just kept on marching these modules east out into the desert, towards the desert. And so, when you go to Irvine, there's just one of these modules after another going on for like 30 miles into the gloaming. And they were highly rationalized, meaning that, they thought they were doing the right thing at the time. But they're exactly the kind of suburban design that is going to be a problem for us in the future. And all those places are going to become problematical, and they're going to lose their value, and eventually there'll be slums or salvage yards or ruins, and that's how we roll.
And I've lived there for 7 years, too.
Right. Like.
Mhm.
Well, I was just gonna.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say like, in terms of California, like people here talk about saving the planet and whatnot, but like we really drive more cars than like anyone else, and on top of that, like the legislators are never going to address that. And so the only thing we really have going for us, and this is this is like a small thing, but it's a thing, is we have a better electricity grid than much of the rest of the country. We don't get as much of it from coal and natural gas as much of the rest of the country does. So we get like 50% from renewable and nuclear power, and that's pretty good. But and that's the only thing we really got going for us. Everything else is pretty bad about here. The urban planning's pretty horrible. San Francisco is pretty good in terms of urban planning, but like LA, like Orange County, just like a never-ending band of strip malls, highways, gas stations, regular malls. It's like more than just having to drive a car. It's just an ugly place, in all honesty.
Yeah, may I jump in? And I was going to point out Los Angeles has a problem with visual pollution with billboards and plastic signs. And despite all the efforts that they have tried to push people into transit and all that, it hasn't done a good job. Despite the fact the LA area has the highest density in the country, it's still heavily car dependent. So you have these critics like Wendell Cox that say, yeah, well, LA is getting denser and it's not working. I'm like, increasing density is not our main goal. It's just, but anyway, what do you think about that?
I think that's generally a useful view of the situation. You can have a lot of density and still have a completely screwed up living arrangement, and that's what they've managed out there. Look, the whole thing's been cobbled together. My new theory of history is that things happen because they seem like a good idea at the time. So we did a lot of things in this country that seemed like a good idea at the time. And then the time is going to come when they don't work anymore, and people will discover it's not such a good idea anymore. Unfortunately, we will have squandered an enormous amount of not just our national wealth, but the national wealth that we ever had a chance to develop, any potential to develop in the future. So that's going to be a problem when we have to reconfigure the country. It's going to be an emergent process. It's not going to be planned by people. It'll be, and when I say emergent, I mean it'll be self-organizing. It'll respond to the circumstances that reality presents, and it'll happen. For example, one of the things that happened over the last 50 years was we built all these strip malls and power centers and giant malls, and we destroyed every downtown and every main street and every small town in America. But what's happening now, of course, is that these places are going out of business, and a lot of people think that means that they'll just be replaced by Amazon and things like Amazon, the internet.
Delusional.
And I think that's pretty delusional because, among other things, it implies that absolutely everything you buy has got to make a separate truck trip or drone trip or some kind of journey to each customer. It's absurd. It works at the moment. It happens to work at the moment because we're producing a lot of shale oil and the trucks are still running. But as soon as we get in a problem with trucking, that whole model falls apart. And so emergently, what'll happen, I believe, is that, we're going to have to rebuild our main streets, our business districts, and the commercial hearts of our towns. And I tend to think that our smaller towns and smaller cities are going to be more successful in doing this because they already exist at a scale that's more congenial to the resource realities of the future and to the capital realities of the future. So those are the kinds of challenges that we face, and there will be a new sense of what's a good thing at the time 25 years from now, and then people will do what seems to be a good idea at that new time.
Cool.
Yeah, I was gonna point out that as much as I appreciate the fact that you talk about this system has flaws when the energy prices go up, the problem is that we've heard from this way back in like 2002 or 2004, but we have seen some contraction, but we haven't seen the kind of heavy contraction that we were supposed to see. Basically, gasoline prices here is about $2.70, $3.70 where Thomas is at.
Well, it's about $3, not really, but yeah.
And then if people saw that documentary End of Suburbia, they thought there would be mass vacancies in suburbia, and it's 2020, and I'm sorry to sound critical, but we haven't seen the heavy contraction that we were supposed to see. We haven't seen oil prices just now make all-time highs, and I think you mentioned in that lecture in Monterey where we're not going to be rescued by the hypercar, but then a lot of people might say, well, hey, well, we see the Tesla coming in, and that's the car of the future, and it certainly has getting more and more into the scene. So what do you say about those critics, Mr. Kunstler?
Well, I do have a reply for all of that, and starting with the oil situation, I think that we're going to end up being disappointed by what the shale oil miracle amounted to. I think it amounted to a financial stunt. It was kind of a manifestation of 10 years of ultra low interest rate borrowing, and it was an industry that depended absolutely on generating an immense amounts of debt. And many of the companies that went into it have been going bankrupt, especially the last 2 years. And we're going to see more and more of that. So it's really with shale oil, it's kind of a two-way race between the depletion profiles of the wells, because they deplete very rapidly, and the depletion profile of the incoming loan money that they depend on to keep their operations going. So the shale oil miracle really dragged out this process by a good decade or more, but I don't think it's going to persist that much longer. As far as a Tesla and electrifying the automobile fleet, just because you can demonstrate that you can build an electric car, it doesn't mean that you can be able to really ramp up a viable industry in it. It's like you can do a science project, but science projects don't always scale. The fatal problem for the electric car industry now is that the middle class has been so decimated that there are fewer and fewer people who are even qualified for car loans, and that's how Americans are used to buying cars. And cars now are much more expensive than they were 5 or 10 years ago. I had lunch with a friend of mine in town yesterday who has a used car business. It's a pretty good one too. It's pretty clean and honest. And he told me that I think the figure he said was the average price of a new car now is $33,000. And so as the price of those things goes up, the ability of Americans to borrow the money and get a car loan diminishes. And it's even more true right now of electric vehicles, because they cost about 10-20% more than gasoline cars. So there are many ways for these hopes and dreams to founder, and it makes me sad to see a whole nation become kind of delusional about where this is all going. I understand that there's a desperate wish to keep all the stuff that we've got running up and running. But just because you wish something doesn't really make it come true. And the fact of the matter is, we're not going to run the USA or its components of suburbia, the military, the interstate highway system, Walt Disney World, Walmart. We're not going to run those things on any combination of alternative energy or alternative fuel systems. And we're really going to have to make major rearrangements in American life. We're stuck in this predicament that I call the psychology of previous investment, which means that we've put so much of our money in this infrastructure for living that we can't imagine letting go of it. And that's unfortunately where we're at. So around the margins of all that comes all this wishful thinking about how we're going to keep doing what we're already doing, and how we're going to keep it all going. And most of it, I think, does not really comport with reality.
I just wanted to ask one question. This is for Jim. What do you think of the creamy nougat center in the Earth theory?
Well, that's the theory of abiotic oil, and it has its admirers and proponents. It's the idea that oil is actually generated at some ultra deep level under the Earth's crust, and that it bubbles up through the many layers of into the mantle of the Earth and into the crust, and replenishes the oil wells. And there's you know, there's absolutely no evidence that that's true. It's just a fairy tale. So what do I think of it? You know, I've made fun of it in the lectures I do. It's the idea that the Earth has a creamy nougat center of oil that keeps on coming up. And you know, look, you can't stop people from having crazy delusional ideas, and if it makes them feel better, that's good for them.
Well, you're right. I was gonna say, well, after you answer the question, but you know, even if oil was abiotic or whatever, it really wouldn't disprove peak oil, because peak oil really only deals with our ability to get it out of the ground. You know, even if there's tons and tons of it, not all of it can be not all of it can be extracted from the ground at a price, you know, around $20 to $80 a barrel that we can afford. You know, a lot of it is like $100 a barrel, maybe even higher than that. And so that's what many of the people who object to peak oil don't understand. They conflate what's actually in the ground with our ability to extract it at a price we can afford.
Right, and that's called the energy cost of energy.
Right.
Well, I will point something out, that he does have a lot of very good predictions in that film, End of Suburbia. He pointed out, I think Americans will elect maniacs who will promise to keep their McMansions, their big box stores, or suburbs in their commutes. And we have seen a lot of maniacs for candidates, and who've even gotten elected for almost 20 years. And a lot of it is because it's the promise that they want to continue to prop up this car-dependent culture. And a lot of people don't know that so much of our economy is dependent on literally this establishment. They actually pointed out that if this self-driving car becomes totally dominant, so many industries are going to be wiped out. So he has had a lot of good predictions. And even in that lecture around that same time, he says, like, yeah, like, Americans are spilling their blood overseas and what their last thought of home is. And it is really depressing, you know, that we've created this cartoonish environment. But the problem is people just don't see it. They're used to it. Like when I was a little kid, I used to think this is normal. This is how we should build things. But people just haven't realized it. So I think Kunstler, where he does really his biggest strength, is when he attacks suburbia, the architecture, the planning. That's when he does a really good job. Which leads me to another point. I really appreciate his tone on traditional architecture, but what me and Thomas were not a fan of is new urbanism and smart growth. We don't think these people are really doing a good job either. So we need a third plan.
I would just add that the problem with smart growth is the word growth in it. It's still presuming that.
Well, that's true. Especially when you actually step back and you realize that what we're entering is, in fact, an era of contraction. I've never been really on board with the smart growth idea. I didn't even like the name of it. You know, just this whole idea that we're going around calling everything smart is just a form of self-flattery that's kind of repulsive to me.
That's the one thing Mr. O'Toole got right.
However, I've been allied with the new urbanists for 25 years, and I still consort with them. And I think that there's a lot to admire in what they did. To really understand what the new urbanists represented, I think you have to realize that they came about in a transitional era. The new urbanist ideas came together at a moment in history when we were just first beginning to recognize that the way we were behaving, the stuff we were building, was not good for our society in some fundamental ways.
Amen.
And they began to develop at least an appreciation for traditional building, and especially traditional town building and design and assembly of places to live that predated automobile dependency. And then they applied it to new projects. And many of those new projects are pretty good. Now, the fact that they had to operate within the paradigm of the suburban builders is an unfortunate part of the time that we live in. But you know, the most of the development that occurred in the United States in the last 30 years, you know, 99% of it was done by the conventional developers, and you know, 1% of it was done by the new urbanists. The stuff that they did was generally pretty good. But the real lesson of the new urbanism is that we're going to have to return to traditional urbanism, which means a living arrangement that really responds to the economic realities of our life. And then, of course, there's a whole other dimension to it, which you touched on, which we haven't talked about, which is just the fact that suburbia and all the crap buildings that it contains really damage our neurology and really damage our souls, because you know, from living amidst this ugliness. And there is a way to describe it that I think is useful, that if you understand something about physics, for example, which represents the laws of the universe, really. If you understand something about physics, you can see that the immersive ugliness of suburbia is entropy made visible. Mm-hmm. And entropy is a force in nature that you don't want to mess around with. Entropy is the force in physics that represents stasis and death.
Huh.
And every time you are induced or seduced by entropy to live in an entropic kind of situation, you're killing a little bit of your soul and the soul of your culture and your society and your civilization. And that's the true tragedy of the way Americans are living. We're immersed in this entropic soup of ugliness that sends a message to us that you know, is a deadly message.
Yeah, and what's really worse, the most disgusting part about this, Mr. Kunstler, is we're the richest society in the history of the world, and we have been for decades. And we've chosen to take our money and build big box retailers and parking lots and
strip
waste
malls,
it on prescription drugs and spilling it on wars and banker bailouts, rather than creating the most beautiful places in the world.
Well, you know why we did that?
Credit.
It made sense at the time.
No, I just told you 10 minutes ago. It seemed like a good idea at the time.
Right.
That's all you need to know.
I partially agree. I think it was largely because of codes, regulations, and subsidies.
Well, they seemed like a good idea at the time.
Yeah, but it wasn't really the free market. That's my point. And
they were part of, you know, the society that generated the rules and regulations and laws for how it was going to behave, and they seemed like a good idea at the time. You know, you can actually see exactly what happened with the zoning problem. You know, zoning starts in the early 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
And for reasons that are obvious. It's because all of a sudden America is becoming overwhelmed with industry, and especially the cities. And they're making the cities really obnoxious places. So, you know, a decision is made, wouldn't it be a good idea to sequester these activities in a limited portion of the town, so to you know, to keep it from screwing up the rest of the city or the rest of the town? And that, you know, that seemed like a reasonable idea. But then after World War II, we elaborated that, and we decided that shopping was an obnoxious activity that shouldn't be allowed in the town either. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly where you got the disaggregation of the residential part of the town from the you know, the shopping, so that you know, the subdivisions, all the housing subdivisions all over America, don't have a little general store in the middle of them.
Right. And then
everybody has to get in their car and, you know, and drive 2.5 miles to, you know, get a loaf of bread.
Yeah, and I live in an apartment complex, and it's all gated. The homes are all squished together, and there's literally like a little gate, but it's closed. You can't get out, and you still have to drive around for like half a mile to get out and then go to the convenience store. It's a complete joke. And a couple of things, because number one, the shopping isn't compatibly designed with residential, and also the residential is so separated. among different types, apartments, luxury, mid-sized, you name it. It's a complete sham. The cul-de-sac, dead-end streets, collector roads that separate everything so much. It's really, really become disgusting, which leads me to one point. I think, like I mentioned before, people are very limited choice. And I think it's also because the inner cities, the old cities, have so many problems. They're too expensive. And I think one of the main contributors of suburbia, which you may disagree, Kunstler, is I think it's demographics and immigration. In the 60s, we had the civil rights era that caused all the riots. A lot of people left the cities. And then you had all this heavy immigration here and in places where Thomas lives, where culturally the areas changed, whether they came here legally or not. And then people continue to move out to the outer fringe suburbs. So
well, you packed a lot of ideas together that I don't think that you tied them together very well, and I'm not really sure what your point is. Sure, we've had a lot of immigration, and sure, we've had a lot more exurban suburbia, and sure, there has been a need to house a lot of people. And that's true, but I'm not sure what conclusion you're trying to draw from that.
Well, I think I could elaborate on what he said.
Go ahead.
I would just say, I mean, I think he kind of overplays it, but it is a phenomenon that is real. Like, what's the word for it? During the 1960s, right? It accelerated a process that was already happening since the 40s and 50s. Because of the civil rights movement. You had the race riots in Detroit, and a lot of people left. And Detroit was still a fairly, vibrant city that a lot of people liked to live in. It was
the seventh richest city in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And a lot of people left because, people like not getting shot. People like living in places that are safe. And so people will, like all these progressives will hand-wring about, white flight, but really the white people were just doing what was logical and not wanting to get shot.
Yeah. And?
They left.
Yeah. So, I mean...
And then you also have to factor in the heavy immigration from Asia and Latin America has a significant contribution too. I mean, look, the fact is, people just want to live separately. They like to live with people that are like themselves. I mean,
that tends to be true. But I would also point out that we're talking about a lot of different cultures here, and they don't all behave the same way.
Right.
American black people, African Americans, went through a certain historical arc of difficulty in many ways, and it didn't end with slavery. And one of the problems with the current situation is that you've got all these old industrial cities that attracted a lot of black people from the South at the end of the Second World War, because the mechanical cotton picker had come into use. And, the sharecroppers were basically being made obsolete. So they all came to they didn't all come, but, many of them came to the industrial cities of the North. And, 20 years later, those factories were offshored to Asia. So they had a 20-year window where they had good jobs at General Motors and Chrysler and Ford. And, after that, the rug was pulled out from under them, and they were left marooned in these cities. And one feature of that is that, they brought a lot of behavior from the South with them to these northern cities. So, a lot of what I think you're seeing there, and Nicholas Lehman wrote a book about this about 20 years ago called The Great Migration. It's worth reading.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the behaviors that we now see in the urban ghettos were behaviors that to some extent came from the rural South, in the especially after slavery was over. And that included a lot of having children with other men, women having children with a lot of different men, and that has created a tremendous social problem of kids who are raised in families without fathers, and without and that translates into behavior problems. So that's one set of problems. And whatever behaviors people brought from Asia, and all the people from Asia aren't the same either. The Chinese who came here are not the same as the Malays or the Indians or
or Cyrus.
Iranians, yeah.
You all have different cultural traditions and behaviors. So, a lot of the people who came from Asia were already outfitted with cultural norms that helped them tremendously when they got here. They believed in hard work, and they had strong family, and that all worked for them. So that certainly wasn't all bad.
So just quick question. Do you think that immigration levels are going to reverse given the calamity we're going to see? Because there's been a lot of concern with immigration and public charge, welfare, crime, voting habits, employment, and we are seeing a lot of deportations and self-deportations have been going on the rise. We have 11 to 20-something million people who don't have legal papers. So do you think that there's going to be a mass exodus out of the United States?
Well, I don't know. It depends how disorderly the United States is going to get, and I think it'll get pretty disorderly. I think we're entering a period of considerable breakdown in norms and politics, and I think Donald Trump represents the beginning of that. Now, my position with Trump is pretty simple. I didn't vote for the guy. I do regard him as something of a buffoon. But he also is kind of a necessary disruptor to a tremendously corrupt system. And when all is said and done, I'm more upset at the moment about the behavior of his antagonists than I am about Trump.
Right.
Awesome.
And if you understand that simple statement, you'll understand where I'm coming from. Now, as far as immigration goes, we've already entered turbulent times. There are tremendous demographic movements going on all over the world. There are parts of the world that we can easily see are places that have overshot the carrying capacity of the region. A lot of them are in the Middle East. The petroleum economy and the industrial economy of the last 100 years has allowed these countries to grow their populations to a point that the region simply can't support them. That's one of the things that happened in Syria, and one of the things that was responsible for plunging it into chaos. Not just the interventions of Islamic maniacs and the United States and the CIA and the army. So there was a lot going on there. These demographic movements are probably going to become even more insistent and desperate. And I think that people will continue to come to the United States, but I think there will also be a recognition, and it's beginning to happen around the world as a kind of a cultural consensus. As each nation looks at what's happening and decides, maybe we ought to step back our immigration. I think that a consensus will build that for a new age in which, it becomes a lot harder to get into another country one way or another. Now, the Europeans just went through this experience where they were flooded with Muslim refugees and some of them political refugees, most of them economic refugees. And from what I can tell, many of these newcomers have been behaving pretty badly in the places where they went, and despite all the pleas of the political correctness, there's finally beginning to be a resistance to living that way. They don't want to live in a country where every 3 days some maniac drives a truck into a crowd of people, or walks out into London Bridge and starts slashing throats. That's nature's way of telling you that you've got a cultural problem.
Wrong people.
And finally, it's beginning to get through their thick heads. But as far as America is concerned, I do think we need to strengthen the immigration laws,
Yeah.
we do that periodically. We did it in the 1920s after a 50-year bonanza of immigration after the Civil War. In, I think, 1923, we passed a much more restrictive immigration law, and we said, okay, we need a timeout. So at least you could say that. At least you could say, you know what? We've got, 11 to 20 million illegal people in this country, and plus, tons more people who came here legally. And maybe we need a timeout from that just to see if that'll help a little bit and renormalize our society. Because one of the things that we really need to do if we want to continue to be a viable nation is that we've got to rebuild a common culture. And that means, a consensus about shared values. And that has been fought against violently by the political correctniks for the last 20 years, with the diversity and inclusion program.
Cringes.
And the multicultural program. And the fact of the matter is, you need some fundamental basis of a common culture in order to have a nation. And so all of those things militate against it. And that's become a huge problem for us. We just don't have any, agreement about shared values.
Well, quick point, because you do kind of sound like Tucker Carlson. He kind of said almost exactly what you said when he was debating Cenk from the Young Turks. And then last night, he actually did a segment about traditional architecture in Washington, D.C. So it's really good to see that, your viewpoints are really becoming acceptable in all forms of the political spectrum. But Thomas, go on. What were you going to say?
Well, this is, yes, I think Trump is kind of a buffoon. I don't deny that fact. But this is one thing he is, doing better. He's better than what the alternative would be in this area.
Yeah, I agree with that.
The public charge rule got implemented recently, and that'll greatly reduce the number of people who come here. And he is building the wall gradually through the military. And, I think the public charge rule is good because we have too many people on welfare as it is. It is not something we can afford, and we need to have less people on it. And we need to make sure whoever comes here, can contribute something so that...
Yeah, or at least has the potential to make a living.
Right, or because we need people who could, help, maybe redesign things or whatever.
Well, we're not going to, we're not going to redesign America simply by importing people from other places who know better. But that's going to be left pretty much to, the people who are here.
I know. It's just that we'd have a lot less people coming here, and more of those people would be people who would be useful to us. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, well, in any case, I'm in favor of reforming the immigration laws and letting fewer people in, because there's just going to be desperation all over the globe as this contraction accelerates, and there's just less and less stuff for people, including food,
right,
and basic necessities, and we're going to see one desperate place after another. So, and we can't let them all in the United States. You can make these sentimental arguments about it, and that's mostly what they are. They're sentimental arguments. Don't you feel sorry for these people? Yeah, I feel sorry for them, but you can't let them all in, and it's not our fault. And they got to figure this out in their own countries.
I was just gonna before we continue on. How much more time do you think you have left? That's all I'm asking.
Well, I'll go for another 10 minutes.
Oh, that's fair.
Okay. Well, I was just going to point out that, which gets me to the part where the Southern Poverty Law Center really likes to sham you, because then you have some people that are part of the alt-right that don't want the demographics to change. These were the Charlottesville people. And then you have some that don't want the immigration because they've seen what's happened in states like California, where it has literally not only changed the culture, but the voting habits, because it's pretty obvious that primarily the Democrats want heavy immigration because it boosts their voting base. And it's
that does seem to be pretty obvious.
Yeah, and I think people voted for Trump because they don't want their states to be like California, New York, Illinois. businesses are leaving, and this is what's really making people scared of the Democrats.
Well, I think that's one thing that is very troublesome and worrying about them, for sure. Yeah, it seemed what you're describing is a racket.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would just add to that, though, I wouldn't blame California on the immigrants. You know, that's kind of not true. Like, the white people here, like, they're, like, super liberal, and honestly, they're kind of, like, stupid, and most of them, like, should not be allowed to vote or have opinions.
Not here.
Yeah, so, like, if you look at, like, what is it? Like, there's, like, this map that says, like, if only white people voted, California would still be a blue state.
Yeah, and
I don't think California is. I don't think California is as liberal and radical as it is simply because there are a lot of immigrants there. But you know, unfortunately it's just generated a pretty bad consensus about how reality works.
Well, this leads me to another YouTube user, because me and Thomas, about a couple of years ago, we used to go to town hall events primarily on immigration. And there was this YouTube user talking about the craziness of California, and not just in immigration or bad laws from Jerry Brown and Gavin Newsom, but he would also criticize smart growth and the regional agencies that were putting in this stack and pack housing and this light rail and transit. And I'm like, Gary, look, I agree smart growth has issues like the plastic high density housing, but just because we criticize suburbia, we're not all Agenda 21 United Nations tyrants or whatever. We're just people who are saying we want to bring back the old-fashioned cities like Pasadena and Glendale and all these other places that were built in a traditional walkable way. And he doesn't tell you that Sprawl is heavily infested with code subsidies, federal intervention with the interstate highway system. He doesn't tell you about this.
Yeah, that's an old story, and it's true that, you know, they overlook really what is keeping a lot of that going when they make their arguments.
And again, I really think, you know, you should condemn these ugly stack and pack housing, these urban growth boundaries, which leads me to another point, because you have these people like Wendell Cox that say, well, the main reason why home prices are being inflated is because people like Kunstler are advocating for high density development, and that caused the real estate bubble and all the crash in Portland and California. And he's kind of distracting away sort of from the zombie banking system. So that's right, you Kunstler, you're the main cause of the housing affordability crisis.
I apologize.
Well, I would just add one thing, you know, and I think this would be probably my last statement, but I would just say this whole idea that there's a conspiracy to get people out of their cars, like, I wish there was, because it isn't working. Like, no, there is no.
I agree. There isn't a conspiracy to get people out of their cars.
And like it's as dumb as the idea of a creamy nougat center of oil. It's as stupid and retarded as that.
Yeah, and you know, when the time comes that people have to get out of their cars, they'll get out, and they'll figure out another way to organize their lives.
Amen.
And then we'll look back, and I'm sure we'll look back on at least parts of this experience with some nostalgia, because it was awful nice to get inside this giant machine and, you know, rev it up and be able to just drive 150 miles on a whim. That was a very luxurious privilege.
Yeah, it was.
But, you know, things come to an end. But, you know, it was also a luxury of a different kind in my town in 1920, 100 years ago, that you could walk down to the local train station and catch a train to Troy, New York, or Albany, and get a train to New York City. And the whole journey would take about 5 hours altogether. And you didn't have to pilot your own vehicle and be attentive and battle the weather and be worried about whether you're going to fall asleep at the wheel 5 miles outside of Nyack, New York. And, you know, it was very luxurious to just step off a train and be in this great city, and then being able to step back on the train, you know, a day later and go back home and walk from the train station to your house. So that was a great luxury too. And, you know, we'll find new ways of enjoying the human condition and enjoying the landscape and enjoying our lives.
Right, life was still pretty good in the 1920s, and they didn't have Disneyland, but they had, amusement parks that were built on piers. They were much smaller scale, but
They had all kinds of things. Look, every home in the United States had a piano,
yeah,
practically. Many of them
Wow.
did. And that was in the days when that was coming out of the period where there was very little recorded music, and the quality of it was pretty poor before the First World War. And so people made music in their homes, and they made music with other people, and they had many associations outside the home, and they had many places to go outside the home where they could fraternize with other people and make music and have fun and just enjoy other people. Because that's, when you really get down to it, people like being with other people. And
right.
so we've got all of these amusements and entertainments and distractions now, and they actually keep other people from being with each other, and that's not really working so well. It's
Bravo.
it's created a very sad and lonely society.
I agree. And this is what I was going to say a lot of times, that America has experienced a lot of loneliness, a lot of decay with family morals. You've talked about the tattooing epidemic. You did brilliant works in your film Radiant City. Even the YouTube user Black Pigeon Speaks has quoted you very, very well. And, we've got this horrible two-party system. We have the student loan crisis, the healthcare issues.
I think we're going to have a
farming.
one-party system pretty soon.
Well, yeah, like there's these left-wing people. They want a fully automated luxury gay space communism. Like, that's not going to happen. It's going to be partially mechanized, scarcity, heterosexual fascism on Earth. That's what it's going to be.
We're going to have a one-party system for a while, because I think the Democratic Party is going to blow up this year. It's looking like it's so disordered and so ill and so sick that it's just not going to make it.
Right. And I would also add that, I'm not sure what your views on religion or whatever, but, I think all this stuff, it shows the uniqueness of mankind, because we're just so capable of destroying and altering the environment like no other creature can. Like, I don't know of any other creature that does that. So,
well, beavers do a pretty good job around here, but you don't have them in Las Vegas and Orange County.
They don't get to the scale we do. They don't build Beijing.
Right. Yeah, and they don't use they don't use artificial materials.
No.
And I was going to point out that you've done brilliant interviews with Max Kaiser and Chris Martenson, but I want to make sure that everybody knows that be wary of those guys, because they have had a lot of bad predictions about pumping gold and talking about dollar collapse, because since high school for about 10 years, I've got into the stock market. I've done very well. Don't mean to brag. All-time highs yesterday. So, which leads me to this point, like, if you're talking to the average millennial, somebody in their 20s, what should we really, really do? And how can we make this world really a better place?
Well, you start with yourself. I think Jordan Peterson is right. First you clean up your own room before you start worrying, taking up grandiose campaigns to change the world. I think young people have to think very carefully of what part of the country or what part of the world they're going to settle in and try to make a life in, because as you both know, and as you both said today, there are parts of the country that are not really suited to the situation in the future. And there's quite a difference between the places that aren't and the places that are. And there are an awful lot of places that don't look too good.
Yep.
That don't look like they're going to be, they're going to thrive. So you've got to figure out what part of the country you want to be in. You've got to figure out some kind of a vocational strategy that does not necessarily depend on being hired as a cubicle serf for some big company. And that means probably you better develop some skills, some real hands-on skills, and learn how to do some things. And, I think the rest follows pretty much.
So I think that's a good place to finish it off. So
I have some final remarks. So I do Revit design for a living, and I still think it's very important to bring traditional elements of architecture and urban planning, the 1920s and before, back to our society. But yeah, okay, I will consider doing some hands-on training. But like I said, I will work very, very hard to make sure that sprawl and also new urbanism, these systems are not necessarily the dominant form. And I think we're going to have to do mixed use transit that's more efficient, and pedestrian areas without these two parts. And I have a lot of respect for people like you and Andres Duani, but it's just the way you guys have been doing this, the planning exactly, and all the criticism. I like I said, I think we need a third option. And I just to close it out, it's really, really sad that we as a society, we're used to this kind of planning and design. We haven't woken up. I think this is really control by the ultra elites. And by the way, going back earlier, I just want to point out, I apologize for interrupting. I'm really passionate about this topic. I think you've done a brilliant work about exposing the problems of suburbia, and it's really early out here, so I just woke up. So,
well, I think
It's 9:15 for God's sake.
yeah, well, out here we're night owls. So,
Okay. All right. Well, I wish you guys well. I have a new book coming out in a few weeks. It's called Living in the Long Emergency. And
feel free
it'll
to
be
plug it, you know. So,
pardon?
well, I said feel free to plug it.
Yeah, well, I just did.
Okay, great.
You know,
Well,
so I have a new book coming out. My blog appears every Monday and every Friday at kunstler.com, KUNSTLER.com. It's amusing and usually has a few good gags in it every week. And that's it. I got to go, guys.
well, thank you for your time, and sorry for the technical issues, but I got it all working, and thank you, both of you guys, for being
Okay.
here.
thank you guys so much. And if you guys are interested, my YouTube channel is Cyrus992. I'll be talking about many of the issues. Great pleasure talking to you all.
Good luck with your work. Being a young guy, we're going to depend on guys like you to get it right. So do good and do no harm.
Amen.
Okay, bye,
Appreciate
guys.
your words.